Chapter 7. A Loving Family. Many kilometers down the river there was a small cabin with beautiful red flowers in the windows and a blue front door. Vegetables grew in the yard, and there were apple trees and green fields around the house. Reino Nurmi and his wife lived here. They came from Finland and had a 10-year-old daughter, Helvi. Life was hard in this wild place near the forest, but the Nurmis were strong people. They worked hard and had a good, simple life. They ate the food that they grew. They caught fish in the river and sold wood. Unlike her parents, Helvi was born in Canada. Every day she walked through the lonely country to the school bus. And every afternoon, when she came home, she told her parents about life outside their small farm. One Sunday afternoon, Helvi was playing down by the river. She was throwing stones across the water. She was lonely and wanted a friend to play with. Suddenly, a big wave came past. Helvi was safe because she wasn't standing in the river. She stood and watched, then saw something strange. What was it? It looked like a small, wet body. It turned round and round in the water and was then pushed onto the rocks. Helvi ran along by the water to look more closely. Then she shouted out to her mother, "Mother, Mother, come here quickly! There's a strange animal in the river. It's caught in the rocks." Mrs. Nurmi was out in the yard, planting vegetables. She hurried down to the side of the river, calling to her husband at the same time. He followed her, walking calmly, with a quiet, thoughtful face. They all looked down in silence at the small, thin body on the rocks. Then Mr. Nurmi put his hand lightly on it and pulled back the skin above and below one eye. He turned and saw Helvi's worried face close to his. "This cat's been in the water for a long time," he said. "He's very weak. Shall we try to save him?" Helvi and her mother both wanted to save the poor animal. So Mr. Nurmi picked up the wet cat and walked back to the cabin. He put the cat down in a sunny place by the fire and dried him. Then Helvi's mother opened his teeth, and Helvi poured a little warm milk into his mouth. The cat shook, coughed, and some milk came out of his mouth. Mr. Nurmi pressed his body. The cat coughed again, and a stream of river water came out of his mouth. Then he lay down and went to sleep. Mr. Nurmi smiled happily. "Keep him warm and quiet," he told Helvi. "But are you sure you want a cat?" "Oh, yes," answered Helvi, as she looked down at the sleeping animal by the fire. Her mother went into the kitchen to make supper. Her father left to feed the chickens. Helvi sat by the cat and watched patiently. Sometimes she put her hand near the fire and touched the soft, warm body. After about half an hour, the cat woke up. Helvy looked closely into the bright blue eyes. The cat looked back and slowly started to move. Very excited, Helvy called to her parents. After another half hour, she was holding the Siamese cat in her arms. Then she gave him some milk. He usually hated milk, but he drank it quickly. Then he started washing himself from head to foot. As the Nurmi family ate their supper, he finished a bowl of meat. Then he walked around the table legs, asking for more food, his tail straight in the air. Helvy thought he was wonderful. That night, the Nurmis were having fresh fish. It was cooked in the country way, with the head still on, in a soup with potatoes. Helvy put the head with some soup and potatoes into a bowl and placed it on the floor. The cat ate everything, holding the bowl down with his paws. Happy at last, he lay down near Helvy's feet and went to sleep. For the first time in her life, Helvy had her own pet. Helvy carried the cat up to bed with her. He lay on her shoulder as she climbed the steep stairs to her little room at the top of the house. She put him into the old wooden bed that she slept in as a baby. He went to sleep there happily. Late in the night, she woke up when the cat climbed on her back. The weather outside was cold, wet, and windy. Helvy got up to shut the window. Then she lay down again and felt the warm, comfortable body of the cat on her bed. When Helvy left in the morning for the long walk and ride to school, the cat lay by the window. His hair shone in the sun as he washed himself sleepily. His eyes followed Mrs. Nurmi as she moved about the cabin. She went outside with the washing and looked back at the cat. He was standing on his back legs, looking out at her. His mouth was opening and shutting behind the window. She ran back, opened the door, and he followed her to the washing line. He sat by her, and then followed her around the cabin and yard all morning. When she shut him in the cabin once by mistake, he cried out loudly. He followed the Nurmis around all day. "Why is he watching us all the time?" Mrs. Nurmi asked her husband. "Maybe he needs to be near people." But her husband noticed the worried look in the cat's blue eyes. When a bird flew near him, he didn't look up. "No, it's because he can't hear," Mr. Nurmi said. "I think the poor cat's deaf." Helvy ran most of the way home across the fields. When she saw the cat, she picked him up. He sat on her shoulder while she helped her mother with the supper. She saw that her father was right. The cat was deaf, and his ears didn't turn toward any sound. After supper, her parents sat by the fire, and Helvy read to them. Because they were Finnish, they couldn't read English. But Helvy learned English every day at school, so she helped them with the new language. They sat and rested, with the cat near their feet, and listened to the child's soft voice. She had a book about Siamese cats. great, proud Siamese cats from all over the world. As they listened, they looked down at their visitor. He lay in front of the fire, with his tail sometimes moving. His beautiful blue eyes watched their daughter's hand as she turned the pages of the book. They touched his soft body and wonderful tail. Then Helvy gave him a bowl of milk. He drank it proudly, like a king, before she carried him upstairs to bed. That night, and for one more night, the cat lay happily in Helvy's arms. In the daytime, while she was at school, he followed her parents everywhere. He walked close to her mother as she looked for wood in the forest. He sat at her feet on the front steps as she prepared vegetables in the sun. He followed Mr. Nurmi and his workhorse across the fields. And in the late afternoons, when Helvy came back from school, he was waiting for her. He was one of the family. But on the fourth night, he changed. He didn't seem comfortable on Helvy's bed. He shook his head and cried out unhappily. At last he lay down and pushed his head into her hand. She noticed that his ears were moving. He could hear every sound in the night outside. She was happy that he wasn't deaf anymore. Soon she fell asleep. When she woke up, later in the night, the bed felt cold. She saw the cat near the open window, looking out over the pale fields at the tall, dark trees below. His long tail moved from side to side. She put out her hand, but he suddenly jumped out of the window onto the soft ground below. She looked down and called out. His head turned for the first time to her voice. His eyes shone in the moonlight, and then he turned away. She realized sadly that he was leaving. He didn't need her now. Crying, she watched him go into the night. He walked toward the river. Soon the running shadow of the cat was lost in the other shadows. Chapter 8. A Catfight. The cat was a fast traveler. Only the rain slowed him down. He hated the wet and hid under a tree with his ears back. When the rain stopped completely, he came out. He walked uncomfortably through the wet grass and often shook his paws. Without his noisier friends, the dogs, the curious cat saw everything. He watched the forest animals, but they couldn't see him. When he met an animal face to face, it turned away. He only slept a little up in the trees. He was a smart and skillful traveler, afraid of nothing. Early on the second morning of his travels alone, he went down to a lake to drink. He suddenly saw two men on the side of the lake with guns across their knees and a dog. The men called out to him, but the cat didn't look up. He put his pink tongue in the water and drank slowly. Both men called out again, amused by the cat. At last he looked up, shook each paw, and calmly walked away. Behind him, the men started laughing as the proud cat continued his journey. The two dogs felt very sad as they traveled without the cat. Teo was the terrier's oldest friend, and he missed him a lot. The Labrador loved the cat too, but Teo and Bodger were special friends. The two dogs tried to hunt for food, but without the cat's help, they didn't do very well. One day they walked near a farm. The young dog didn't want to meet any human beings, but he was hungry. They crossed an open field to steal one of the farmer's chickens. Suddenly they heard an angry shout and saw a man at the far corner of the field. A black farm dog was with him. It ran to attack them. The Labrador was a terrible fighter and was hungry and weak. He was on his back, with the farm dog on top of him, when brave Bodger jumped at the farm dog's neck. He knocked him over. The farm dog struggled to his feet, and the terrier knocked him over again. Then he turned and proudly walked away. The farm dog, usually very brave, stood up shakily. His neck was covered in blood. He ran away toward his master. The farmer watched the two dogs running away across the field with one of his chickens. "Come back here!" he shouted angrily, but the dogs were too far away. Bodger felt stronger and braver after this fight. That evening he caught a small animal and had a delicious supper. Louis was badly hurt, but he seemed happier too. Maybe it was because he could feel the west wind. Memories of home came back to him. He knew that every day, every hour, they were getting nearer. The cat was following the Labrador and the old terrier. He knew which way to go. He could smell his friends clearly. But he began to feel nervous and afraid. Something was wrong. Something bad was following him. He started to walk through the forest more quickly, looking for the blue sky and open country far in front of him. Suddenly, every hair on his back stood up. He could hear and feel an animal behind him, and it was not far away. The cat jumped up into a tree and looked down. There, moving silently through the forest, was a huge cat, and it was very different from an ordinary cat like Teo. This one was almost twice as large, heavy, with a short tail and thick legs. Its coat was soft gray and darker in some places. It had the wild face of a killer, much stronger and faster than Teo. It was a lynx. Teo quickly climbed to the top of the tree. The lynx heard him and stopped suddenly. It looked up, lifting one heavy paw. Its terrible eyes shone angrily. The cat looked around nervously, searching for a way to escape. His tail moved from side to side, and he made a low, scared noise. Then the lynx started climbing the tree toward the cat. As its heavy body came nearer, the tree moved dangerously. The cat found it difficult to hold on. Then the lynx attacked with its great paw. The cat hit back. The tree moved wildly, and the cat fell to the ground. He heard the lynx land near him, got up fast, and ran for his life. Almost immediately he heard the lynx close behind him. The cat couldn't turn and fight. This was a dangerous enemy, not a stupid bear. As he ran away, he knew it was hopeless. Every time the cat climbed up a tree, the lynx followed. Its great size shook the tree, and the cat fell off again and again. Then he saw a hole in the ground and ran into it. The hole was too small for the lynx to follow. It lay on the ground and looked into the hole with one terrible green eye. But it soon moved back when some earth hit it in the face. The cat's back legs were working hard, throwing earth out of the hole. The lynx sat back and thought. There was complete silence in the forest. Deep in the hole the cat waited, too scared to do anything. Suddenly, the lynx began to push the earth around the hole to one side with its huge paws. It didn't hear a young boy behind it. The boy was wearing a bright red jacket and carrying a gun. He was hunting, so he walked softly. Suddenly, he saw the wild animal at the entrance to the hole. At exactly the same time, the lynx saw the boy. It made a terrible noise. No fear showed in its angry eyes as it moved toward the boy. In a second, the boy lifted his gun and shot, all in one quick movement. The lynx turned over in the air and fell. It hit the ground and lay there, dead. The boy was shaking as he moved toward the dead animal. He couldn't forget the crazy look in the lynx's eyes. He looked down at it with a pale face, but he couldn't touch it. The boy's father hurried toward his son. He stopped suddenly when he saw the huge body on the ground and his son's white face. The man turned the animal over. "Look, son," he said to the boy, smiling. "Look at that hole. That's where you shot it." The boy smiled back, still shaking. "Tie this red cloth on the tree, son," said his father. "Then it'll be easy to find. We'll come back later." The boy tied the cloth tightly on the tree and looked down at the lynx one more time. Then father and son walked away together, talking excitedly. The hidden cat could hear their voices for a long time. When everything was silent, he came out of his hiding place into the sun. He was tired and dirty. He didn't look at the dead body once. He calmly walked around it, sat down near it, and started washing his body from the end of his tail to his nose. Then he continued on his way, as calm and proud as always. 2 days later, the cat found the 2 dogs. He came down a hill into a valley, and suddenly saw his dear golden and white friends on the other side of a small stream. His tail moved in excitement. He opened his mouth and cried out. The 2 dogs stopped immediately, listening to the unbelievable sound in the valley. The cat jumped up onto a rock so that they could see him clearly. The young dog started to bark loudly and hurried across the stream. The old dog followed, and the cat began to run too. They met near the little stream, all of them very excited. In his happiness, the old dog knocked the cat over twice with his head. The cat ran straight up a tree and then dropped down onto the old dog's back. The young dog stood there, slowly wagging his tail. When the old dog was too tired to move, the Labrador walked up to the cat. Teo stood on his back legs and put his chocolate-colored front paws on the great dog's neck. That night the three friends were happier than any other animals in the world. They lay close together under an old tree near the stream. Bodger had his dear cat, warm and loving, between his paws again. Louis stopped worrying. His friend was back, and he could continue the journey with a lighter heart. Chapter 9. A Welcome Rest. Longridge's house was now 300 kilometers behind them. The three animals were all alive, but only the cat was really healthy. The old dog still struggled along happily, but the Labrador was really weak after the fight with the farm dog. His beautiful red-gold coat didn't shine. He couldn't open his mouth fully because of an aching tooth, so he was hungry all the time. When the cat killed a small animal or bird, he gave it to the Labrador. But the young dog could only drink the fresh blood of the animal. Every day the two dogs walked along side by side, brave and purposeful. They looked like two family pets out for a walk around the neighborhood. One morning they were seen like this by a man who was working in the forest. He was busy with the trees and didn't think about them at the time. But later in the day, when he remembered the two dogs, he was surprised. There were no houses for 40 kilometers. So where did the dogs come from? He told his boss, but his boss just laughed. He thought that his friend was imagining things. "What will you start dreaming about next?" he asked. But a few days later, people started to talk about the disappearance of the three animals. And then the boss stopped laughing. At Heron Lake, the vacation of John Longridge and his brother was ending. In England, the excited Hunter family were packed and ready to return home. Mrs. Oakes was busy in the old stone house, while her husband worked in the yard. At the same time, the three animals continued on their way. The country was less wild now, and once or twice they saw small, lonely houses. The young dog stayed in the woods and didn't go near them. But the old dog loved human beings and looked at the houses with hopeful eyes. Late one afternoon, they were followed by a bear. It was curious about the animals, but was no danger to them. The young dog felt uncomfortable, though, with the shadow of the great bear behind them. He decided to leave the woods and walk along a quiet country road. As it got dark, they arrived at a few small houses, a schoolhouse, and a white church. The young dog wanted to continue, but the old dog suddenly refused to move. He was, as usual, very hungry. And when he saw the warm lights from the houses, he wanted food from the hand of a human being. His eyes grew bright at the thought, and he started to walk toward the houses. The young dog followed. He felt weak and sick after the fight with the farm dog. His bad tooth was very painful. He wanted to lie down and rest his aching head on the ground. As they passed the first houses, They could smell the delicious smell of supper. They heard the sounds of human beings everywhere. The old dog stopped outside one of the houses. He walked up the steps, lifted his paw, and knocked on the door. Then he sat down and listened hopefully. Soon the door opened, and a small girl stood in front of him. The old dog looked up at her with his ugly smile on his face. The girl looked afraid and shouted out, "Dad!" Then the door shut hard in the terrier's face. The old dog couldn't understand, but knocked again. He saw a face at the window and barked politely at it. Suddenly, the door was thrown open again, and a man ran out with a bowl of water in his hand. Angry, he threw the water in the old dog's face. "Get out! Get out of here!" the man shouted. The wet terrier ran away fast toward the Labrador and the cat. He wasn't afraid, but he felt unhappy. Human beings were not usually like that when he was friendly to them. They always laughed and played with him. He quietly followed the Labrador back along the road. 3 kilometers later, they arrived at a farm. They crossed some dark fields and lay down for the night outside one of the farm buildings. The young dog had a bad night. His mouth was aching, and he was exhausted with the pain. He got up in the night to drink from a small lake. He stood chest deep in the cold water. When the old dog woke up in the morning, he was alone. The cat was hunting for his breakfast, and the young dog was down by the lake. The terrier could smell cooking through the morning air. The pale sun was coming up in the sky as he walked to the farmhouse door. He sat down on the steps and waited. His memory was short. Human beings were friendly again and gave dogs food. He knocked on the door with his paw. It opened, and a wonderful smell of breakfast came out. The terrier smiled his ugly smile. There was a silence. Then the deep, amused voice of a man said, "Who's here?" He looked down at his strange visitor, then called into the house, "Come here a minute, dear, and look at this." The warm voice of a woman answered, and then she stood next to the man at the open door. She looked down in surprise at the white dog on the step. When he saw her smile, the old terrier gave her his paw. She shook it, laughing quietly. Then she invited him into the house. The old dog walked in calmly and looked around for food. He was lucky because this man and woman were the kindest people in the neighborhood. Their house was the most welcoming. James and Nell Mackenzie lived alone in the big farmhouse. Their 8 children were adults now and lived away from home. Nell gave their visitor a bowl of food, and he ate it quickly. Then he looked up for more. "He's very hungry," she said, and gave him her breakfast. He ate that almost before it reached the ground. Without a word, James Mackenzie gave him his plate of food too, and some milk. At last, warm and happy, the old dog lay down in front of the fire while Nell cooked another breakfast. "What type of dog is he?" she asked. I've never seen anything so friendly. But he's ugly, too. He's an English bull terrier, said her husband. I love them. He's about 10 or 11 years old. And I think he's been in a fight. The old dog listened and wagged his tail from side to side. Then he got up and put his head on Mackenzie's knee. You are friendly, aren't you? But what are we going to do with you? Nell touched the dog's shoulder and then looked at him more closely. He hasn't been in a dog fight, she said. He's had a fight with a bear. In silence they looked down at the dog by their feet. They could see now that he was exhausted. He had a look of sadness in his little eyes, and he was too thin. This wasn't a brave adventurer, only a tired old dog, hungry for food and love. We'll keep him if he wants to stay, Nell said. I'll tell the police when I go into deep water, said Mackenzie. Maybe we can write something about the dog for the city newspaper, too. If nobody wants him, he can live with us. After breakfast, Mackenzie went down to a small lake to do some hunting. 6 birds flew into the air, and he shot at them twice. 1 bird fell into the water, and another on the ground near the lake. He picked one up, and then, to his surprise, saw the large head of a dog in the lake. It was swimming toward the dead bird. The Labrador caught the bird, swam out of the water with it, and brought it to the man. Mackenzie couldn't believe it. Good dog, he said quietly, holding out one hand. Well done. Now give it to me. The dog walked slowly toward the man and put down the bird. Mackenzie saw that he was in great pain and needed help. He picked up the bird and said, "Follow me," to the Labrador. The dog walked behind him back to the farmhouse. He was too weak to worry about human beings. Crossing the fields with the dog at his side, Mackenzie thought about the other dog. How many more were there in the neighborhood? Maybe another one will come to the kitchen door this afternoon, he laughed to himself. As Mackenzie passed one of the farm buildings, a sleepy Siamese cat looked up. The farmer didn't see him, but the young dog wagged his tail and turned his head. In the kitchen, the man looked in the Labrador's mouth and carefully cleaned his bad tooth. Then he gave him some medicine to help the pain. While Mackenzie was helping Lewis, the terrier watched closely. He didn't want the man to hurt his dear friend. After about an hour, the Labrador looked much better. The old dog sat next to him as he drank a bowl of milk. It was clear to the Mackenzies that the 2 dogs came from the same home, but they couldn't understand why the animals weren't with their family. What are they doing out in this wild country? Nell asked. Maybe their masters died, Mackenzie answered, and they've run away together. Or maybe they were in a car with someone, but got lost. You can see that they've been away from home a long time, and they've been very hungry. How did they find enough food to stay alive? Hunting? Stealing, maybe? Nell suggested. I saw the old dog take some food off a plate on the table after breakfast.
"So they didn't eat much in the forest," said her husband thoughtfully. "The Labrador is very thin. I'll shut them in one of the farm buildings outside when I go to Deepwater, Nell. We don't want them to run away. Now, are you sure you want these two strange dogs?" "I want them," she said, "if they'll stay. But we must think of names for them. We can't say 'good dog' all the time." "I'll think of some names while you're in Deepwater." Mackenzie crossed the yard with the two dogs and put them in one of the warm, sweet-smelling farm buildings. Then he shut the door carefully behind him. The cat sat in the sun and watched. Soon Mackenzie drove away, and everything was quiet again. A few curious farm cats came to look at Teo. Who was this stranger in their favorite place in the sun? Teo didn't like other cats and watched them coldly. After 2 or 3 small fights, the farm cats walked away, and Teo went back to sleep. Halfway through the morning he woke up and walked toward the farm building. He skillfully opened the door with his paws and walked in. His old friends welcomed him loudly and followed him into the sunny yard. When Mackenzie drove into the yard later in the afternoon, he was surprised to see the two dogs outside in the sun. They stood up when they saw him. Then, with wagging tails, they followed him into the house. "Did you let them out into the yard, Nell?" he asked. "Of course not," she answered in surprise. "I took them some milk, but I shut the door carefully after me." "That's strange. We're lucky they're still here," said Mackenzie. "The Labrador looks much better. He'll be able to eat a good meal this evening. I'd like to see him fatter. Nobody knew about the dogs in Deepwater, but they came from the east because somebody in a town to the east saw them on his doorstep. Maybe the Labrador was on a hunting trip and got lost. But what about the Bull Terrier? Why is he with the young dog? If we don't want the dogs, somebody in Deepwater will take them." "No, they won't," Nell said. "All right," her husband agreed, laughing. "We'll keep them as long as we can, dear. But if they're going somewhere with a purpose, Nell, nothing will keep them here. We can feed them well. Then if they leave, they'll have a better start." After supper that night, the Mackenzies and their guests moved into the little back room. It was warm and comfortable, with children's books, pictures, and photos of the family. Mackenzie sat at the table, smoking his pipe. His wife read a book. The Labrador lay under the table in a deep sleep, warm and safe. The terrier slept near him on an old sofa. The only sound during the evening was the noise of a huge catfight out in the yard. Both dogs sat up immediately, wagging their tails. "They look very interested," said Nell to her husband. Later, the dogs followed Mackenzie out to the farm building. He filled a bowl with water, then shut the door behind him. A few minutes later, the lights in the house went out. The dogs lay quietly in the darkness, waiting. Soon they heard the soft sound of paws on wood, and the door opened. The cat walked in and lay down next to the old dog's chest. Then there was silence in the building. The young dog woke up in the cold early morning. He knew that they had to start their journey to the west again. The cat joined him at the door. Then the old dog came, shaking in the cold wind. For a few minutes they sat there quietly, listening. They could hear some of the farm animals moving. They looked across the dark yard. Then they silently crossed it, went into the fields, and started to walk west. In front of them lay the last 80 kilometers of their journey. This country was more dangerous and lonely than before, and the young dog was already sick and weak. Chapter 10. The Search Begins. The Hunter family were on their way home from England. The children, Peter and Elizabeth, were very excited. They wanted to see their home and friends again, and of course their wonderful pets. Every day Elizabeth said to her mother, "I hope Theo hasn't forgotten me." She had a special present from England for him. Peter wasn't worried about seeing Bodger again. He knew that his old terrier couldn't forget him. Their father was excited too. He wanted to see Louis again and go hunting with him. Far away in Ontario, John Longridge returned from his vacation to an empty house. He looked for the animals everywhere. In the house, in the yard, in the fields. He called and called, but there was no answer. Mrs. Oakes didn't know where they were either. She showed Longridge the first page of his note to her, and the burnt second page. "I only read the first page," said Mrs. Oakes. "I thought the animals were with you at Heron Lake." "No, the animals have disappeared," Longridge said sadly. "But they were happy here. Why did they leave?" "And why didn't anybody see them?" asked Mrs. Oakes sadly. "I don't know. I've spoken to some of Bodger's friends at the school. None of the children saw the dogs or the cat on the day I left for my vacation. And the police don't know anything either." Longridge went to sit down at his desk. He read a letter from Elizabeth again. She was excited about seeing Theo and the dogs. In 24 hours, he must tell the hunters the terrible news about their lost pets, and he had no idea where they were. He pressed his aching head into his hands and tried to think clearly. Animals didn't just disappear. Then he remembered Louis on the last morning. His eyes. Something was different, lifting up his paw. Suddenly he understood. "Mrs. Oakes," he shouted, "I know what's happened. I know where they've gone. Louis's taken them home. He's taken them all back to their home." Mrs. Oakes looked at him in silence for a minute. Then she cried out, "No, it's not possible. The hunters live more than 400 kilometers away, and nobody's seen them." "There aren't many people if you go straight across country, over the Ironmouth Mountains," said Longridge thoughtfully. "Over the Ironmouth?" Mrs. Oakes said. "If you're right, then there's no hope. There are bears and other wild animals over there, and no food. Maybe a hunter or somebody has helped them,"
said Longridge, when he saw Mrs. Oakes's sad face. "No, Mr. Longridge, it's impossible. A young dog could cross that country, and possibly a cat. A cat can look after itself, but old Bodger couldn't walk 10 kilometers. No dog as old as Bodger could live more than a day or two in that wild country, and that's a fact." They both looked out of the window at the dark. "You're right, Mrs. Oakes," said Longridge in an exhausted voice. "They left almost 3 weeks ago. I'm sure our old friend Bodger is dead. And Teo too, maybe. Siamese cats hate the cold. But a big, strong dog like Louis may still be alive." "That Louis," said Mrs. Oakes angrily. "Why did Bodger follow him to his death? And why didn't Teo stop Louis? Poor old Bodger." She left the room quickly and shut the door. Longridge knew that she was crying about the animals. With no time to lose, he phoned the police. "I'm sure the animals are trying to get home," he told him. "Can you ask everyone in the area to look for them?" "Yes, of course, Mr. Longridge," the officer replied. "Everybody will help, but we can't do anything until tomorrow morning." Longridge found a map of the area and drew a line between his small town and the hunter's town. The line passed through hills, woods, and lakes, but not through many towns. The last 70 or 80 kilometers looked very wild and dangerous. Longridge felt less and less hopeful as he looked at the map. "Why did I offer to take the animals when the hunters went to England?" he thought to himself. "Now they're dead because of me. And tomorrow Elizabeth and Peter are coming home." Later that night, the telephone rang. It was a hunter in a place called Lintola. "A little girl from the Nurmi family found a Siamese cat in the river about 2 weeks ago," he told Longridge, "but it disappeared again a few days later." "Thank you," said Longridge. "I'll phone Lintola tomorrow and try to speak to the child." "There's some other news, too," the man said, "but I don't know if it's useful. Old Jeremy Aubin came into town and talked about 3 visitors to his house. He never has any visitors, poor old man. Maybe his visitors were animals, not people." Longridge thanked the man warmly, put down the phone, and looked at Lintola on the map. "They are going home," he thought. "I was right. 2 weeks ago, the cat was alive. But what's happened to the other 2? Are they dead?" He lay awake in the dark that night, missing the feeling of the old terrier's warm body next to him on the bed. "You can have the bed if you come back, Bodger," he thought. "I'll sleep on the floor. But please, come back." Chapter 11. Coming Home. In the following week, Longridge's telephone never stopped ringing. Some of the news was difficult to believe. Some of it was hopeful. Longridge listened to it all patiently. Every man, woman, or child
has seen a cat or dog on the road," said Longridge, exhausted, on the phone to Jim Hunter, "and they're all ringing to tell us." "Yes, but they're all trying to be helpful and kind," said Jim Hunter. "And some of them really did see our dear pets. We know from these phone calls that I was right," Longridge said to his friend. "The animals are traveling west along the line of my map. The little girl, Helvi Nurmi, looked after Teo for a short time, and a man saw 2 dogs in the Ironmouth Mountains, and a farmer saw an old white dog who was stealing one of his chickens." Peter smiled for the first time when he heard this. He could see Bodger enjoying himself in a fight, but he knew that his old dog was really dead, and Louis. Elizabeth was different from her brother. She was sure that Teo was alive. "He'll come home soon," she told her family. "I don't believe that he's dead. You'll see." But only Elizabeth was hopeful. Longridge and the rest of the Hunter family looked at the map. The animals were in wild, lonely country. "They can't be alive now," Jim Hunter told his family sadly, "but I hope their incredible journey ended quickly and without pain." Some weeks later, Longridge visited the Hunters again. People continued to ring about the animals, but there was no good news. It was Peter's 12th birthday the following Sunday. "Let's all go to Lake Windigo for a short vacation," Longridge suggested to the family. "But maybe Teo will come back when we're away," said Elizabeth. Longridge showed her Lake Windigo on the map. "It's on the line I drew," he told her. Elizabeth agreed, full of hope. So they left for Lake Windigo to stay in the Hunter's small cabin there. It was almost winter, and the lake was cold. There were no boats, and all the other cabins were empty. Peter had a new camera, and he went into the woods for hours with it. Elizabeth played in a treehouse near the lake. On the last afternoon, the Sunday of Peter's birthday, they decided to go for a long walk. It was a beautiful, clear day, and they walked in friendly silence. Each person was quietly thinking to himself. Jim Hunter missed his dog. He remembered walking with Louis on other fall days, gun in hand, and he remembered hunting with Louis on lakes, waiting patiently for hours in boats with him. Peter remembered his last birthday as he walked up the hill. "Do you remember Bodger last year, Dad?" he asked his father. "I tried to teach him to hunt, but he didn't enjoy it. He soon got bored. Poor old Bodger." Peter suddenly felt very lonely and started crying quietly. But he didn't want his family to see, so he quickly picked up his camera. They sat for a long time on the rocks at the top of the hill. It was very quiet. A bird sang, and another bird ate some of their cookies. Everyone was silent and busy with their thoughts. Suddenly, Elizabeth stood up. "Listen," she said. "Listen, Daddy. There's a dog barking." Everyone listened, but no one heard anything. "You're imagining things," said her mother. "Or maybe it was another animal. We must go back now." "Wait, wait! You'll hear it in a minute, too," said Elizabeth quietly. Her mother remembered that the child's hearing was still very good. She could hear noises that were lost to adults forever, and now even to Peter. So she stayed silent. Elizabeth's excited, listening face changed to a huge smile. "It's Louis," she said. "I know that bark." "Don't do this, Liz," said her father. "It's—" Now Peter thought he heard something too. "Shush," he said to his father. There was silence again, as everyone listened hard. Jim Hunter felt strangely nervous. He got up and hurried down the hill with Peter behind him. Then they both heard the bark. They stood there in the quiet afternoon, waiting to welcome an exhausted traveler. They didn't have to wait long. A small body with a chocolate-colored tail came running through the trees on the high hillside. With a welcoming cry, the Siamese jumped down the last 2 meters and landed at their feet. Elizabeth was smiling all over her face now. She got down on her knees and picked up the excited cat. "Oh, Teo," she said softly as she took him in her arms. He put his brown paws lovingly around her neck. "Teo," she said again, kissing him, and Teo tightened his paws around her neck. A second later, the Labrador arrived. He was much thinner and weaker than before, a shadow of the beautiful dog Longridge knew. He made excited noises as he jumped up to his master. When Longridge saw his friend Jim's face, he had to turn away. Minutes passed. Everyone started talking excitedly at the same time. Louis barked and barked. He was shaking all over his body, and his eyes never left his master's face. The cat, on Elizabeth's shoulder, joined in with loud cries. Everyone laughed, talked, or cried at the same time. There was a lot of noise in the quiet wood. Then suddenly there was silence. Everybody was thinking the same thought. No one looked at Peter. When Louis ran to him, he turned away. "I'm glad he's back, Dad," he said. "And your Teo, too," he added to Elizabeth, with a difficult smile. Elizabeth, usually the happy one, started to cry. Peter touched Teo behind the ears. "You go back to the cabin," he said to his family. "I want to go up the hill to take a photo." "Shall I come too, Peter?" Longridge asked, and to his surprise, the boy accepted his offer. They watched the rest of the family walking down the hill. Teo lay in Elizabeth's arms, and Louis walked close behind his master. Peter and Longridge returned to the top of the hill to take some photos, and all the time they talked about everything, but not about dogs. At last Longridge looked at his watch. It was time to go. He looked at Peter. "Let's—" he started to say, but he stopped when he saw the boy's excited face. Down below, out of the darkness of the woods and into the light of the sun, came Bodger. Thin and tired, hopeful, happy, and hungry. Bodger, the dear old terrier, was coming as fast as he could. He started to run, faster and faster, and threw himself at Peter. John Longridge turned away then, and left them in the private world of boy and dog.
He started walking toward the lake when he suddenly saw a small animal in front of him. It ran past his legs, and its long tail disappeared up the hill in a second. It was Teo, returning for his old friend. They were ending their incredible journey together.